Good morning and welcome to the second edition of Gen.T Stream. I'm Tamara Lamounière, the head of Generation T.
Good morning, my name is Lee Williamson. I am the editor of Gen.T.
It's 9 a.m. in Hong Kong and we're coming to you live from Taffer House. We are joined by hundreds of founders and top executives from all over the world this morning. Thanks to all of you for being here and we hope you're staying safe wherever you are.
We don't yet know, of course, when this pandemic will be over, but we do know that if we do not use this unique situation as a chance to pause, to reset, and to change our ways, it will be a once-in-a-lifetime chance squandered. And that's why our theme this morning is creating social impact in a post-COVID world. The global pandemic has raised important questions about the way we live, about the way we work. It's exacerbated long-standing issues of social inequality and forced us to consider the next looming crisis staring down humanity: climate change. Ultimately, it's helped us realize that the way we lived for decades was unsustainable and unjust. The question now remains, where do we go from here? How do we build a more sustainable and equitable future post-pandemic?
To help us answer this question, over the next hour, we'll be joined by world-class speakers and experts in their fields. We'll be starting with data scientist and social researcher Christopher Wylie on how data can be used for good. Then we'll be unveiling the winners of the Gen.T Credit Suisse Social Impact Awards 2019-2020. The awards recognize young leaders who have made significant contributions to Asian society in the fields of social impact, sustainability, and innovation. The winners have been selected from the annual Gen.T list, the definitive reference of the most promising entrepreneurs in Asia. After that, Dr. James Gifford, Head of Impact Advisory at Credit Suisse, will join us to talk about creating a new world with the next generation, before we end with a fireside chat with Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales on the topic, Building a Better Tomorrow.
And now it's time to introduce our first speaker. Data scientist and social researcher Christopher Wylie came into the public eye in 2018 as the whistleblower in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, famously admitting to the world, quote, "I made Steve Bannon's psychological warfare tool." After a year of Senate and parliamentary hearings in the US and the UK, very little substantive action was taken. But Christopher continues to campaign for ethical AI and regulation of big tech. In the last year, his advocacy led him to star in the Netflix documentary The Great Hack and publish a book, Mind F***K. I can't really say the full word on a webinar, I'm afraid, inside Cambridge Analytica's plot to break the world. He's now research director at global retailer H&M, where he's helping the company build ethical AI systems and use data to create more sustainable supply chains. This morning, we're going to discuss how data can be used to make companies more ethical, sustainable, and ultimately more successful. Christopher, welcome to Gen.T Stream. Looks like Christopher is just connecting with us. We can see Chris's name, but we can't hear him at the moment or see his video.
There
Hi.
we go. Hi.
I'm afraid we still can't hear you. I can see your lovely face, but we can't hear you now.
All right.
Oh, great. We can hear you. That's amazing.
There we go. Okay, cool. All right, we're now connected.
It wouldn't be Zoom without a tiny technical snafu. Let's hope that's the only one we have. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to focus on the solutions this morning. That's what we want to do. We want to be really solutions oriented. But before we do, I think we need to kind of set some context, set the scene, if you will. How is tech broken, would you say?
So I think, when you look at sort of what's happening around the world right now, it's fairly apparent when you look at the fractured nature of politics in many parts of the world, the United States, in Europe, even arguably in Hong Kong, that there are a disintegration of social cohesion. And more broadly, when you look at the pandemic, the proliferation of conspiracy theories related to the pandemic and the vaccines and anti-vaxxers, right. There's a common source to this, right? And I think one of the things that we have to take a step back and look at is there is a common architecture that we are all now using in order to communicate, and that's social media. And right. when you look at the sort of underlying designers of these things and surveillance capitalism, I think the issue really is that, we have not yet regulated a system that is causing a lot of harm.
Mm. The epilogue of your book is called A Note to Legislators, right? Where you try and fix some of these issues that you just identified. In that chapter, you mentioned that unlike engineers or architects of buildings, software engineers aren't required by law to conduct risk mitigation planning, even though, the scale and therefore the potential for damage is much greater. You also cited the fact that in 2018, the UN concluded that Facebook played a, quote, determining role in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people, and still regulation is not forthcoming. So what does smart regulation look like in this sense, and how do you think we get there?
Well, I think, really understanding that, one of the things that, people like Mark Zuckerberg, will talk about in public in terms of their platform, they'll describe Facebook as a free service.
Right.
And, I take issue with that because, if you use the logic of Silicon Valley, anything is a service, a blah, blah, blah is a service. I could argue that the building that I'm sitting in is shelter as a service, which is sort of, silly. And so I think, when you're looking at a discussion about, what to do about problems on social platforms and more broadly with misinformation, I think the first thing that we have to understand is that these are architectures and constructions. When you look at the job titles of people who work in Silicon Valley, it's not service relationship manager, it's, architect and engineer. Mm-hmm. And when you look at other sectors that are indeed highly technical, whether it's in aerospace engineering or telecoms or pharmaceutical research, there are certain sets of principles that we apply to standards of engineering, namely the precautionary principle, whereby, prior to releasing technologies into the public, whether it's medical technologies or aerospace or whatever, you have to conduct certain amounts of safety testing and risk mitigation. And also, in addition to that, you are accountable to a third party, typically a public regulator who inspects your work. And right. If we're talking about solutions, I think one of the things that we really have to understand is what is the actual problem? And the problem is faulty construction. Right. And we already have a lot of legal mechanisms in other sectors that can address that. And I don't really see why, social platforms and more broadly software on the internet has to remain a completely unregulated sector, particularly when it touches every aspect of our lives on a minute by minute basis.
Absolutely. And we're already starting to see some of the effects of what you're describing. What are the consequences moving forward if we don't get this regulation right? How much worse can things get?
Well, I think, if you look at sort of where we are right now, we're just at the precipice of sort of the proliferation of AI into, most aspects of our life. So people are just starting to put, Amazon Alexa into their living rooms. But if you think about that sort of trend 5, 10, 20 years from now, what happens when we are sitting in our living rooms, watching our smart TV as our TV is watching us, where, our refrigerator is monitoring the food that we eat and having a conversation with that television about you as you're watching it. And every aspect of, your house with all of your quote unquote Internet of Things, your networked home, is watching you and thinking about you. And the real risk there is what happens to a person's agency when every aspect of their life is now mediated by something that is motivated to optimize them as a consumer. What happens to personal choice when there is no happenstance, when everything that you start to see is premeditated. And there's something quite fundamental about what's happening to, humanity in that sense, because throughout human history, we've evolved in a passive environment. So even though nature may impact us, it doesn't have an intent. When we were, primitive beings in a forest and we were chasing animals for food or animals were chasing us for food, those would have an impact, but the forest itself wouldn't have, a plan for us.
Right.
And the biggest difference is now we're constructing a world where as we grow up and as we sort of move through our lives, that world all of a sudden has intent. And there's something quite perverse and scary about the idea of everybody living in a world which is thinking and watching them at all moments in time, where it knows what you're doing, where it seeks to influence everything around you, where it can see you at all times, but you can't see it. And there's a fundamental discrepancy in power there when you create that environment.
You mentioned the term earlier, right? It's surveillance capitalism. In 2020, we are well into the era of surveillance capitalism, where products are ostensibly free, but we are the commodity, our attention, our behavior, and the potential for that behavior to be modified by advertising. So, Christopher, hundreds of entrepreneurs and executives from around the world are watching us this morning, some of whom I know for a fact have free-to-use digital products funded by advertising. So what can they do to ensure their businesses, their AI systems are operating ethically in this new world?
Yeah, I think when you look at the sort of problems with what Shoshana Zuboff terms surveillance capitalism, the real issue is not necessarily each individual product or service. It's the overall impact or ecosystem that then gets created, in particular when that ecosystem is dominated by a particular company like Facebook or Amazon.
Right.
In terms of what an actual specific company can do, I think having policies about ultimately choice enhancing architecture. A lot of what we sort of criticize as dark pattern design on the internet is really designed to move people away from making a choice that they otherwise would make were it not for a particular design that makes that choice difficult.
Yeah.
And I think moving away from that sort of mentality of design into creating choice enhancing architectures that respect agency. And more broadly, to a broader point, if you work in marketing, what is happening on the internet right now and the evolution of surveillance capitalism is actually a threat to your very existence, because there will be no more need for marketing when you create an overwhelmingly dominant information architecture that can simply decide what products you see and don't see. So, even if you are a marketer right now and you are benefiting from a digital ecosystem that allows you to sell your products, that may not be the case 10, 20 years from now, where you were made redundant by an algorithm.
I'm looking at our marketing executive right now behind camera. He's sweating a little bit based on what you just said. You came into the public eye. Let's look at the positive side a little bit more. You came into the public eye revealing how data was being egregiously misused. And today, your work demonstrates how data can be used for good. So can we expand on that a little bit, please, for the entrepreneurs who are watching? How can data be used to make companies more sustainable and ultimately more successful and profitable?
Yeah, so I mean, working within a large retailer like H&M, there are a countless numbers of issues, whether it's in sustainability or inclusivity, where you can use data to better anticipate demand and reduce waste, and also better understand the breadth of the population. So in the particular case of fashion, a constant challenge of fashion is understanding how to create better fitting clothes that are more inclusive to different shapes of bodies around the world. That is a data problem as much as it is a design problem. When you look at the overproduction and waste of products, that is a mismatch in consumer demand and supply. That is a data problem. So there are many sort of aspects, particularly in where the sector that I now work in retail, where you can use data specifically to reduce waste and also increase inclusivity. Data doesn't necessarily have to always be used to manipulate, or artificially sort of generate consumer demand. You can you treat people with respect and also look at real problems in the world and optimize a solution using information. Data is simply information. It's just you can use it to make smarter decisions, and ultimately it's not so much the data that is at issue, it is what your intent actually is to do with it.
Right. So the question is not so much how we can fix data as how we can fix humanity.
In a way, yes. I mean, data is, I think of data as like electricity, right? So electricity is manifestly dangerous if it is not contained in a safe structure or environment, right? So you can kill people with electricity. If you have faulty wiring in a building, that poses a substantial amount of risk to the people in that building. Your building could light on fire, or somebody could be electrocuted. But we wouldn't say that electricity on the whole is bad simply because there are risks that are posed to people. What we say, we need building codes and standards in order to maximize the utility of electricity, but prevent the real and substantive risks that power can pose to people. And I think data is the same, and AI is the same. It's a thing that is powerful, and you can use that in a good way, or you can use that to harm people. And it ultimately is, like anything, down to people.
It does feel like the 20th century and the early 21st century, cars, electricity, they were about technology's service to humanity. There were risks involved, but they were mitigated in one way or another. Tech was about how it can give us a better quality of life. It can connect us with loved ones, help us fight diseases, and so on. But now it feels like we're in a battle against technology and the dangers it poses more and more. Are you optimistic that we can flip the narrative back to what it was, as tech in service of humanity rather than a threat?
I don't see myself in a battle against technology. I see myself in a battle against people who misuse technology and software malpractice fundamentally. So I don't have a problem with the internet. I love the internet. I love software. I love engineering, and I love data. But I know, as somebody who works in it, that can pose real risks to people. And through my own journey, I've seen how people can be genuinely harmed as the result of software and data. And for me, the battle, so to speak, is making sure that people in my position and more powerful positions like Mark Zuckerberg really give due consideration to the public interest when they're creating products. So it's not so much a battle against technology as the misuse and abuse of technology and bad design.
And if you're an entrepreneur, you just finished your pre-seed funding and you're building a service based on data, and you're watching today, what's one thing you want them to take away as to how they can be using data as a force for good?
I think don't be douchey with what you make. So I mean, and I say that, there's all kinds of tempting things that you can do when you have a lot of information or access to information about people. And just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And, the thing that I would say is, particularly if you operate or you intend to operate in Europe or perhaps even the United States and other Western markets, there is a trend towards reining in the Wild West of of software development and data science, where regulations either are coming into place or will come into place. So do not premise your constructions on the basis that what you can do now will even be allowed in 5 years' time. And indeed, even when you look at China, just next door to Hong Kong, there are very stringent privacy rules in that country as well. So, I think if you're creating things, privacy will ultimately become part and parcel of technology. I'm very confident of that. I think that, right now we're in the sort of growing pains of the adolescence of the industry, but this industry will mature. And when you look at the history of every other industry that has gone through that maturation, innovations were started in a completely unregulated space. Dangers were posed to the public, and regulators stepped in to create safety standards. And I really do think that will happen with digital platforms.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That's really insightful. But the thing that most people are going to remember about this conversation is don't be douchey. I'm going to get that printed on a t-shirt. I think that's great. I think ultimately that's what it is all about. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Cheers.